want to welcome you to this study in the book of Colossians. Now, you have this one blessing. In fact, you got a whole lot of blessings, but this is a blessing because today we're going to give you the background into this book of Colossians, or at least some of the background. Sometimes people say, why do you take time and give background? Because if you don't know the background, you don't know the book. And we want you to have a knowledge of the book of Colossians, a knowledge that's up here, but a knowledge that's down here also. And so we start out with just giving you a very, very brief description of what's going on in the area of Colossia, who's the writer, and all of that. So let's just start out with this. Let's start out with the who, the where, and the when. Anytime you study a book of the Bible, those are the questions that you need to ask, not only at the very beginning of the book, but those are the questions that you need to ask as you study that book. The who. Who is writing this? Well, it's very obvious who's writing this, because right there in Colossians, the first chapter, the first verse, it tells us that Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. Now, we're not going to take and diagram this sentence yet. We're going to do that in a couple of days. But who is the writer? Paul's the writer. We believe that Paul is the writer, and there is basically no questions about it. Paul is the writer of the letter to the Colossians. But notice that there's another person mentioned in this first verse. And it says, Paul and Timothy are brothers. So we understand that there's two people, and they're writing this letter together. I don't believe the Apostle Paul wrote it, and Timothy just stood there and twiddled his thumbs while Paul was writing. If that would have happened, you know what? There were probably a half dozen people in the room while Paul was writing. And they would have all been mentioned in the beginning of this letter. No, I believe Paul and Timothy were working on this together. They were talking it out. They were saying, this is what's going on in Colossia, and this is what's happening. And I believe that they were working together in the writing of this letter. Now, that brings us to the where. Where was this letter written from? Well, this letter was written from Rome. This letter was written during Paul's first imprisonment in Rome. Now, many believers don't realize this, but Paul was actually imprisoned in Rome at two different times. The first imprisonment that Paul had, which is the one in which he's writing this letter, his first imprisonment was more like house arrest. There was not any formal charge even given to Paul at this time. He is just sitting there in a house arrest. He is being detained, is what we would call today, but he is under house arrest. Now, what this meant is that he was under guard all the time. But it also meant that people had the freedom to come and go and minister to Paul, to talk with Paul, to get instruction from Paul. Paul could lay hands on them. He could send them out. I mean, Paul had a whole lot of freedom. Now, that was actually completely contrary to his second imprisonment, in which Paul was placed in what we think was the sewer system of Rome, and he was sentenced to death, and that's where he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and several other books of the Bible. Now, where was Paul writing from? He was writing from Rome. Why is Paul in prison in Rome? Paul is imprisoned in Rome, or under house arrest in Rome, because Paul is preaching the gospel. Now, when was this written? Now, the letter to the Colossians was written somewhere between 55 and 61 AD. Now, there are some people that say it was written 52 to 55 AD. I don't believe that, because it just doesn't completely line up with all the facts. So I'm going to say the letter to the Colossians was written somewhere in 60 or 61 AD. It was probably written at the same time as the letter to the Ephesians. So we know that Titus delivered the letter to the Ephesians, and we believe that he also delivered this letter to the Colossians. And I believe that basically Titus was the mailman. He was the one carrying the letter to the Ephesians and to the Colossians. And so therefore we date this letter as about 60 to 61 AD. Now let's take some time and talk about the city of Colossia. The city of Colossia is in Asia Minor. Now, one interesting thing about the city of Colossia. The city of Colossia was about 11 miles from the city of Laodicea. Actually, in the Lycus Valley, which Laodicea was in the Lycus Valley, the city of Colossia was in the Lycus Valley, and then another city called Hierapolis was in this Lycus Valley, a very fertile valley, a very beautiful valley. But the city of Colossia was once a major city, but the Roman government came and they put the interstate through to Laodicea. Now, I'm just joking about the interstate, but the Roman government actually built a road into the city of Laodicea instead of the city of Colossia. And what happened is the city of Colossia became a small city. And at the time of this writing, the city of Colossia was no longer a major city, it was a small city. Now, Colossia was known to be an agricultural area. It was known for the type of wool that they produced. The city of Colossia was a multi-ethnic area. There were native Greeks in the city of Colossia. They were involved in all types of Greek worship and Greek gods and Greek mythology. And that's important to keep that under your hat, get that in your mind. That's important because we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Colossian heresy. Now, the city of Colossia also had about 2,000 Jewish people. Now, again, remember the city of Colossia at this writing is a small city. Now, we're going to talk in our next video about the church at Colossia, and then we're going to begin to talk about what is known as the Colossian heresy. And it's so vitally important that we understand that. So join us in our next video tomorrow, and God bless you until we speak to you again.